Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here. It's rather I be here than anywhere else. What can be more rewarding than participating at the Conservative Summit? There's nothing higher than the summit. And, well, thank you for the kind words of introduction. I will share with you some thoughts on, well, various topics, the current world and Eastern Central Europe. Okay, until recently it seemed that following the fall of communism, the Western world, and indeed much of the globe, has entered a phase of stabilization, and the future of the West looked relatively optimistic. First, it seemed that liberal democracy would long-term organize life in Western countries, creating balance and giving all political forces a say in political life. Second, that in a free world encompassing a much wider scope than before, human beings would benefit from the freedom and their individuality and creativity would flourish as never before. Neither promise has come true, and both for the same reason. The Western world quickly transformed into a monopolistic structure, both politically and ideologically. International structures emerged, the European Union being the most prominent example, which have largely departed from the parliamentary system with its democratic legitimacy, separation of powers, and accountability. Instead, we have structures with unclear and constantly expanding competences, including supranational tribunals and other forums. What made this monopoly possible is the existence of the so-called mainstream. The mainstream was the product of 1968 revolution, which ended with the victory of the left and the capitulation of the right. In Europe, the mainstream's agenda boils down to the following 5 points. 1, the recycling of Western society through immigration from non-Western countries. 2, the recycling of human nature by abolishing the dual division of the sexes and by undermining family marriage and the morality of life and death. 3, the recycling of Western culture supposedly contaminated by discrimination, misogyny, racism, and other sins. 4, the deification of nature, capital N, with its relentless emphasis on green energy. 5, the construction of an international system of power imposing those principles from above, irrespective of the will of national institutions and national constituencies. If we look at today's world in this way, the role of conservatism seems obvious. None of the above points is tenable, and all are a recipe for disaster. Its first symptoms are already visible. We see the effects of mass immigration, democratic collapse, a decline in security, a decline in education, social atomization, and so on and so forth. It doesn't take much observation to recognize that a growing number of people in Europe are dissatisfied with the existing system. This does not mean, however, that a major wave of conservatism has been unleashed. What raises the greatest objections are immigration, green energy, and international structures of power. And in relation to these objections, the conservatives can count on allies and work with them for greater sovereignty of nation states energy prudence, and a halt to immigration. The last issue is difficult because the number of immigrants in Western Europe is enormous, so social recycling has already taken its toll in many respects. Whether Eastern and Central Europe will play a significant role in channeling the growing dissatisfaction, we do not know. It certainly has the means to do so, but whether it will dare to take a firm stand against the monopoly remains to be seen. Half measures, being and not being part of the mainstream, would not do. Accommodation is certainly not a solution. The strategy with the view that we might be able to save this or that if we partly accommodate to the dominant idiom is a straight way to capitulation. Unfortunately, those who pursue this strategy are legion. A lot of conservatives in Europe or elsewhere in the Western world have already capitulated. The Christian democratic parties meekly succumb to the strategy of accommodation, which in practice meant abandoning conservatism and Christianity. The vast majority of Protestant churches have also capitulated lock, stock, and barrel, deluding themselves that accommodation would mean survival and that capitulation will ultimately lead to revival. Unfortunately, we see similar tendencies in the Catholic Church. One cannot resist the feeling that the existing monopoly has a diabolical power to benumb the will and besot countless individuals and organizations. Breaking the political and the ideological monopoly in Europe is all the more difficult because it is guarded, this monopoly is guarded by the European Union. So any move against it immediately ignites a conflict with European institutions. And in our part of the continent, this scenario has not yet been accepted, either by the majority of the citizens or by the majority of political leaders. The former still cannot imagine opposing the EU, while the latter have turned into faithful factotums of the mainstream and have a vested interest in maintaining its power. The countries of our region are internally divided. Some groups and organizations defend the mainstream while others oppose it. Those who oppose it stand on firmer ground. The sad fact is that the affiliation of Eastern and Central European parties and institutions with the mainstream does not grant them freedom of action at all. Rather, it makes them executors of decisions over which they had no influence. To some extent, therefore, opposing the mainstream today also represents a desire for our countries to regain a significant portion of their lost sovereignty, lost not only and not necessarily through our consent, but often appropriated by European institutions. The opposition to the mainstream does not have to take a radical form immediately. For a start, we should revise the Visegrad Group and begin to act in a coordinated manner. I had the opportunity to witness for myself a few years ago, while still an active politician, when I attended meetings of important European statesmen. I remember how irritated they were by the increased activity of the Visegrad Group, which at that time was still present in international politics. This irritation demonstrated that the V4 group could make a difference. The consequence of political monopoly is ideological monopoly. The monopoly is of a particularly sinister kind because it has led to a widespread formatting of the minds. As under communism, millions of people lavishly praise liberal democracy for being a unique system of freedom, as if not seeing the obvious, namely the conspicuous constraints of freedom in Europe and the growing repressiveness of the legal systems. Millions of people have been taught to extol pluralism, yet it is conformity that marks today's societies, not diversity. However, it is not that all those people lived in ignorance. Far from it. More and more of them are perfectly aware that expressing the views that dissent from those of the mainstream is becoming increasingly dangerous. To be on the safe side, they therefore prefer not to speak out. Thus, fear has crept into liberal democracy, not as great as under communism, but noticeable nonetheless. This massive formatting of the minds has become possible for many reasons. One of these was that we have come to accept a warped view of human nature, reduced to simple components and forms of action, such as pleasure and pain, preservation of life, desire for power, sex, etc. Hence, man has become helpless against the various ideological waves with which he is being inundated. Having degraded metaphysics and eschatology, having pushed aside an epistemology based on truth, ethics based on the concept of the good, and disqualifying them as too nebulous, suspect, and having an unsavory hidden agenda, he has no intellectual and moral tools to see through all these ideologies. And having no recourse to a strong sense of truth and goodness, he has fallen prey to whatever comes and whatever has a stamp of modernity, to whatever promises more freedom and gives him ever new entitlements. The fact that this promise is false makes no difference. The deceptive language of ideological monopoly, combined with the power of bureaucratic structures enforcing this ideology, has made modern man increasingly less of an inner-directed individual and increasingly more of an other-directed one. He believes he has been subjected to a whole system of various necessities, biological, historical, sexual, economic, ideological, to which he cannot but conform. At the same time, he is bombarded with the rhetoric of liberation and emancipation, of autonomy and self-realization. No wonder that we have masses of indistinguishable individuals, each claiming to be a rebel and a heretic. It is a paradox of our times that they have created a human being that is both docile and hubristic. The conservatives are therefore faced with the task of saturating the public space and culture with content that will restore to people a better view of themselves. To understand our status, we must return to the concept of human nature that was passed down to us by the ancient and Christianity. It is to the Greeks and Christians that we owe the view that, on the one hand, we are metaphysical beings who search for the truth and fulfillment by opening ourselves to the absolute, and without this opening we fall short of our nature. On the other hand, that we are social or political, as Aristotle would have said, beings who can develop through good moral practices within the community. To summarize and simplify the above, the conservatives face two goals. One is for our countries to regain the vast area of sovereignty that was annexed, and the other is for the human person to regain his full nature and thus his self-mastery. Of course, sovereignty alone does not guarantee good order in the state, just as self-mastery does not guarantee good order in the soul. But these are simply the preliminary conditions. What we know, however, and the several decades of the EU conclusively proved this, is that limiting sovereignty by an external authority causes disorder in the state. Likewise, we also know that human beings are likely to fall into inner disorder if they mindlessly and unreflectively accept what the powerful consciousness-forming industry provides for them today. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.